A black woman walks into the Atlanta federal courthouse expecting a fight. But she doesn't expect that. She's delayed, chased, ignored, forced to wait while others are waved through. What will happen? Will she stay silent? Let's see how this story unfolds, only on H2 Black Thread. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest videos. Because the truth deserves to be told. Let's begin. The air inside the Atlanta federal courthouse was thick with the scent of old books, stale coffee, and the weight of unspoken tension. The marble floors reflected the overhead lights, polished yet cold, like the system it upheld. Monday mornings were always a whirlwind of activity. Lawyers rushed in and out, paralegals carried stacks of paperwork, and murmurs of legal proceedings echoed off the high ceilings. Angela Hayes stepped through the heavy glass doors, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She was used to power, boardrooms, negotiations, high-stakes contracts. She had fought her way to the top, built her own company, and survived more betrayals than she cared to count. But today was different. Today, she wasn't in charge. Today, she was at the mercy of a system that had never been designed to protect people like her. She exhaled slowly, adjusting the strap of her leather briefcase, which contained every document she needed for her case. She was here to hold Callaway Enterprises accountable. The company had stolen her contract, used underhanded legal tactics to lock her out of a deal that she had built from the ground up. And now, she was fighting back. The evidence was on her side. All she had to do was get inside. 8:30 a.m., the first red flag. Angela approached the check-in desk, where a court officer in her 50s sat flipping through a stack of papers with practiced boredom. Rachel Quinn. Her name was printed neatly on a gold-plated badge pinned to her uniform. Angela cleared her throat and handed over her paperwork. Angela Hayes, I have a hearing at 9. Rachel barely looked at her. She took the folder, flipped through it without reading a single page, then glanced at Angela for the first time. Something in the woman's gaze lingered, a flicker of hesitation before she slid the paperwork back across the desk. You'll have to wait outside, Rachel said flatly, gesturing to a row of cold metal benches against the far wall. Angela blinked. Wait outside. My case is scheduled for 9 sharp. Rachel shrugged, not meeting her eyes. You'll be called when they're ready. Angela hesitated. This didn't feel right. She turned slightly, glancing at the line of people checking in behind her. One by one, they handed over their paperwork, received a nod from Rachel, and walked straight through the double doors leading into the courtrooms. None of them were told to wait. Angela's jaw tightened. She forced herself to remain calm. Maybe this was just a routine delay. Maybe they needed to process something on her case file. But as she stepped toward the benches, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a mistake. 8:47 a.m. The pattern emerges. Angela sat down, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the edge of her briefcase. She glanced at the other people in the waiting area. A black mother in a navy blue blazer sat beside her, scrolling through her phone but clenching her jaw like she already knew what was happening. A Latino businessman on the far end of the bench bounced his knee impatiently, his gaze flicking between the courtroom doors and the clock. An older Asian man in a suit was staring at the floor, his fingers folded together in silent frustration. Every single person waiting looked like her. And every single white person who arrived at the check-in desk was let straight through. Angela watched as a middle-aged white man in a navy blue polo walked up to the desk, holding a thick manila folder. Rachel didn't even look through his paperwork before gesturing him inside. 15 seconds. A young blonde woman, no older than 25, stepped forward next. Rachel greeted her with a smile, skimmed her documents, and waved her through. 10 seconds. Angela's grip tightened around the handle of her briefcase. A familiar voice in her head whispered, "Let it go. Don't make trouble. You know how this goes." But another voice, louder this time, said, "If you stay silent, nothing changes." 8:55 a.m. The smirk that said everything. Angela looked up just in time to see Thomas Calloway walk in. Slick as ever, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, he strolled past the check-in desk without stopping. Rachel glanced up, made brief eye contact, and nodded slightly. Angela's stomach turned. Calloway was the opposing lawyer in her case. He worked for the firm representing the company that had stolen from her, and he knew exactly what was happening. He smirked as he walked past her, like this was all some kind of game, a power move designed to show her that no matter how much she fought, the system would always be on his side. Angela refused to look away. She held his gaze, refusing to shrink beneath his arrogance. But inside, her anger burned. 9:05 a.m., the breaking point. Angela checked her watch. Her case was supposed to start 5 minutes ago. The man sitting 2 seats down from her, a lawyer with graying temples and a permanent frown, leaned in. "Have they called your name yet?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, I was told to wait," he sighed, tapping his fingers against the armrest. "I had a feeling." Angela frowned. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, another person approached the check-in desk, a black woman in a red blazer holding a small folder. Rachel barely looked at her. "Wait by the benches." The woman sighed, turned around, and took a seat at the far end, pulling out her phone but clenching her jaw just like Angela had earlier. Another 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Angela watched, furious, as more white men were let in immediately. Her pulse pounded against her temples. This wasn't an accident. 9:15 a.m., the moment everything changed, a balding white man in an expensive charcoal suit rushed in, muttering about being late. He barely broke his stride as he waved his folder in the air. "Courtroom B, right?" Rachel lifted the rope for him immediately. "Go on in, Mr. Hayes." Angela snapped. She shot up from her seat. "Excuse me." The room went still. Rachel glanced up, irritated. "What?" Angela held up her paperwork. "I've been waiting here for almost an hour. My case was scheduled for 9. That man just arrived and walked in without being stopped." Rachel exhaled loudly, flipping through a pile of documents like she was pretending to be busy. Then, without looking up, she repeated, "You'll be called when they're ready." Angela's patience snapped. "You just let that man through without even checking his name." "Why is that?" Rachel's eyes finally met hers, and in that moment Angela saw something smug, something dismissive. "You need to calm down, ma'am." Angela's stomach twisted. Those weren't just words, they were a warning. And then the double courtroom doors swung open. A tall man in a judge's robe stepped out. His sharp gaze scanned the hallway. Then his eyes landed directly on Angela. "Miss Hayes, why are you still out here?" The entire room froze. Angela Hayes had always known that injustice wasn't always loud. It didn't always come in the form of slurs or overt denial. Sometimes it was quieter, a delay, a shrug, a dismissive glance, a policy that sounded fair but wasn't applied equally. Today, she was experiencing that kind of injustice firsthand. The marble floors of the Atlanta federal courthouse had never felt colder beneath her heels. The whispers of attorneys, the shuffling of paperwork, the occasional burst of laughter from well-dressed men all felt like background noise as she stood there, still waiting, still unheard. But now, a judge was watching. 9:16 a.m., the judge's gaze. Angela turned toward Judge Samuel Prescott, a tall man in his early 60s, with silver-streaked hair and a presence that commanded attention. He wasn't just any judge. He had a reputation for fairness, for cutting through legal games. His expression was unreadable as he scanned the room. His eyes landed on Rachel Quinn, the court officer who had just dismissed Angela moments ago. "Miss Hayes, why are you still out here?" The room froze. Angela took a slow breath. She knew the wrong reaction could turn this situation against her. A black woman speaking up too forcefully would be labeled aggressive. Too quiet and she'd be ignored. So she kept her voice steady. "I was told to wait, Your Honor." Judge Prescott's eyes narrowed slightly. "By whom?" Angela didn't need to answer. The entire hallway knew. Slowly, the judge turned his gaze to Rachel Quinn. 9:18 a.m., the smirk that gave everything away. Rachel had perfected the art of dismissiveness. She'd been in this job for years, and she knew how to hide bias behind policy. But for the first time that morning, she looked uncomfortable. Still, she straightened her back, adjusting her uniform. "Her case must not have been processed yet, Your Honor." Angela felt rage bubbling beneath her skin. A lie, a blatant lie. Judge Prescott's face remained blank. Then he held out his hand. "Give me Miss Hayes' paperwork." Rachel hesitated, too long. Angela watched as her throat bobbed slightly, as if swallowing back an argument. Then finally, she grabbed Angela's folder from the stack and handed it over. Judge Prescott flipped through the papers. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, then his lips pressed into a thin line. Angela saw the exact moment he realized. He lifted his eyes to Rachel. "This has been stamped and cleared for over an hour." The hallway went dead silent. Angela watched as Rachel's nostrils flared ever so slightly. She knew she had been caught. 9:20 a.m., the confirmation. Angela saw a small shift in the energy of the room. People who had been pretending not to listen were now openly watching. Some of the attorneys had even paused their conversations. Rachel tried to recover. "It was an oversight, Your Honor." Angela didn't let that slide. "Then why was I the only one affected by this oversight?" Rachel turned her gaze toward Angela, and for the first time that morning, her mask cracked. Angela saw it in her tightened jaw, the way her fingers clenched just slightly. Judge Prescott's gaze flicked between them, and then he turned toward the court clerk's desk. "Did anyone else experience a delay this morning?" A few people sitting on the metal benches shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke immediately. Angela's pulse pounded. She could feel it, that hesitation, that fear. But then a woman in a red blazer, the same one Angela had noticed earlier, slowly raised her hand. Angela's chest tightened. Then one by one others followed. A Latino businessman, an older black attorney, an Asian woman clutching legal documents. 5 hands. Then 6. The silent injustice had been happening all morning. Angela turned back to Judge Prescott just in time to see his expression harden. 9:23 a.m., the phone call that changed everything. Before Judge Prescott could say another word, the sound of a phone vibrating filled the silence. Angela recognized it immediately, her own. She reached into her blazer pocket and glanced at the screen. A text message from her assistant, Lauren. Her stomach clenched as she read it. "Angela, I just overheard something. Callaway's firm is delaying your case on purpose. They're trying to buy time to close a contract deal today." Angela's blood ran cold. She turned, scanning the hallway, and there he was, Thomas Callaway. The high-powered corporate attorney had been leaning casually against the far wall, pretending to check his watch. But the moment Angela's eyes locked onto him, she saw it. The smirk, the silent confirmation. He knew exactly what he had done. Rachel Quinn was just a pawn. 9:25 a.m., the trap snapped shut. Angela didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. "Your Honor, I'd like to present additional evidence." Judge Prescott looked at her. "Go ahead." Angela lifted her phone, turned the volume up, and pressed play on a recording. The audio filled the hallway. It was from earlier that morning, Rachel Quinn's voice, dismissing Angela while simultaneously letting white attorneys enter. Then came a second recording, Angela's assistant, Lauren, whispering over the phone, recounting the conversation she overheard in Calloway's office. If we stall her case past today, the board will finalize the acquisition. By the time she gets inside, it won't even matter. The moment the recording ended, Angela let the silence sit. Then she turned toward Calloway. "Would you like to deny it, Mr. Calloway?" The smirk vanished. For the first time that morning, Angela saw uncertainty flash across his face. 9:30 a.m., the first consequence. Judge Prescott turned toward Rachel Quinn. His voice was icy. "Miss Quinn, step into my office immediately." Rachel swallowed hard. Angela saw the exact moment she realized her career had just taken a turn she wouldn't recover from. Judge Prescott turned toward the court clerk. "Issue an immediate hearing for Miss Hayes, and I want an internal audit of every single case that has been delayed under Miss Quinn's supervision." Angela exhaled. She had won this battle. But as she glanced back at Calloway, who was already typing frantically on his phone, she knew one thing: the war had only just begun. Angela Hayes stood taller than she ever had before. For over an hour, she had been dismissed, ignored, and strategically delayed. But now the tables had turned. Judge Prescott had seen the truth. Rachel Quinn had been caught. And Thomas Calloway, the corporate attorney who thought he could stall her case into irrelevance, had just received a very public wake-up call. But Angela knew this wasn't over. It was just beginning. 9:31 a.m., a shift in the room the moment Judge Prescott ordered an internal audit. A ripple of shock spread through the courtroom hallway. Lawyers, clerks, even a few defendants waiting for their own hearings, all had been quietly watching. And now they weren't pretending to look away anymore. Rachel Quinn was still standing stiffly by the check-in desk, her face pale, her hands clenched. Angela had seen that expression before. It was the look of someone who thought she was untouchable, only to realize, too late, that she wasn't. 9:33 a.m., the standoff. Judge Prescott wasn't finished. He turned toward the bailiff, his tone sharp. "Escort Miss Quinn to my office immediately. She will remain on unpaid leave until this matter is fully investigated." Rachel's mouth opened, then closed. Angela could see it, the internal war raging behind her eyes. She wanted to protest, wanted to deny everything, but she knew she had no leverage left. Rachel lifted her chin slightly, trying to mask her fear with defiance, but it was useless. She nodded stiffly, her voice tight. "Yes, Your Honor." The bailiff stepped forward, and just like that, she was gone. Angela inhaled deeply, feeling a sliver of victory, but it was far from over. She turned toward Thomas Calloway, who had been watching the entire exchange with stony silence. And for the first time since this had started, he no longer looked amused. 9:35 a.m., the real enemy shows his hand. Angela knew how men like Calloway operated. He wasn't the kind of man who panicked when things didn't go his way. He was a man who adjusted, recalculated, and found another way to win. So when he finally spoke, his voice was as smooth as ever. "Miss Hayes," he said, stepping closer, "this has all been a very unfortunate misunderstanding, but I'd hate for this to cause unnecessary hostility between us." Angela narrowed her eyes. "Hostility?" Calloway tilted his head slightly, flashing a calculated half-smile. "You've made your point." He spread his hands as if to appear reasonable. "Miss Quinn's mistake was regrettable, but at the end of the day, does it really matter? You're about to have your hearing. You've won." Angela studied him carefully. He was trying to spin this. He wanted her to let it go, to walk into her case, focus on her lawsuit, and forget everything else. Forget that he had actively orchestrated this delay. Forget that there were probably dozens, if not hundreds, of cases before hers that had been similarly delayed. Forget that without the judge stepping in, she might have never been allowed in the courtroom at all. No, Angela wasn't letting this go. 9:37 a.m. the moment Angela made a choice, she lifted her chin. "You think this is over?" she asked, her voice steady. Calloway's smirk twitched. "Isn't it?" Angela exhaled sharply and turned toward Judge Prescott. "Your Honor, before I enter my hearing, I'd like to request that this issue be officially entered into the court record." Calloway stiffened. Judge Prescott's eyebrow arched slightly. "You want this documented?" Angela met his gaze evenly. "Yes." Prescott was silent for a moment, then he nodded once. "Granted." Calloway inhaled sharply. For the first time all morning, Angela had shaken his confidence. This wasn't just a temporary embarrassment for him anymore. This was becoming official, public, permanent. 9:40 a.m. when the silence breaks, the whispers in the hallway had turned into quiet conversations. Angela could feel the shift happening, the way people were looking at her now, not just as a businesswoman fighting a lawsuit, but as someone who had spoken up. And then, something unexpected happened. A man in his early 40s, wearing an expensive navy suit, stepped forward. His voice was quiet but strong. "She's right," he said. Angela turned sharply. The room did too. He gestured toward the courtroom doors. "This happens all the time. I've seen it with my own clients. I've kept my mouth shut, but I won't anymore." Then, a woman in a green dress lifted her chin. "Same." A young black man in his 20s, probably a paralegal, raised his hand. "Me too." One by one, voices rippled through the hallway. People were speaking up. Angela's chest tightened with something powerful. It wasn't just about her anymore. She had started something. 9:45 a.m. the final blow. Judge Prescott nodded. "Enough." The room fell silent again. He turned toward the court clerk. "Issue an immediate review of any cases that may have been affected by Miss Quinn's administrative practices." Angela felt something inside her click into place. This was bigger than just her case now. Calloway's face was tight with barely concealed rage, but he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. 9:50 a.m. the walk into the courtroom. Angela adjusted her blazer and lifted her briefcase. She walked toward the double doors leading to her hearing, but this time no one could stop her. As she passed Calloway, she paused just slightly. "You should have just let me in," she murmured. Then she kept walking, and behind her, for the first time all morning, Calloway had no comeback. Angela Hayes had faced countless boardroom battles, endured cutthroat corporate deals, and fought through obstacles that would have crushed lesser people. But standing in the marble-floored hallway of the Atlanta Federal Courthouse, she realized something. This fight wasn't just hers anymore. She had walked into this courthouse expecting resistance. What she hadn't expected was that so many others had faced the same silent injustice. And now, Judge Samuel Prescott had seen it for himself. The question was, what would he do next? 9:51 a.m. the weight of the moment. The hallway, once filled with the usual hum of courthouse noise, had gone eerily silent. All eyes were on Judge Prescott. Angela could see the wheels turning in his mind, his fingers resting lightly on the folder of evidence she had provided. The man was known for being unshakable, a judge who upheld legal precision over emotional decisions. And yet, right now, even he looked disturbed. He turned slightly toward the court clerk standing nearby. "Are there any other reports of delays under Miss Quinn's supervision?" he asked. The clerk, a woman in her late 40s with sharp features and tired eyes, hesitated. Then she cleared her throat. "There have been concerns in the past, Your Honor." Angela felt a shift in the room. She wasn't the first person to notice this pattern. She was just the first one who wasn't willing to let it go. 9:53 a.m. Rachel Quinn's last stand before Judge Prescott could speak again. The click of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. Rachel Quinn, flushed, stiff, trying to maintain control, strode forward, clearly summoned by the bailiff. Angela saw it in her eyes, the moment she realized just how badly this was going. Rachel folded her arms tightly, her voice carefully measured. "Your Honor, if I may clarify," Prescott lifted a hand. "Miss Quinn." His voice was steady but sharp. "Are you denying that you deliberately delayed Miss Hayes' entry this morning?" Rachel's lips pressed together. She inhaled slowly, choosing her words. "I was following standard procedure." Angela stifled a scoff. Judge Prescott arched a brow. "Standard procedure," Rachel straightened. "Yes, Your Honor. Some cases take longer to process. We need to be cautious about." Angela didn't let her finish. "Then why wasn't everyone subjected to the same delays?" Rachel's jaw tightened. Judge Prescott held up a sheet of paper. Angela recognized it. It was her case file, time-stamped and marked cleared for entry at 8:30 a.m. He turned it toward Rachel. "This file was cleared before Miss Hayes even arrived this morning. Why was she told to wait?" Rachel's face flushed deeper. Angela saw the tiniest flicker of panic behind her eyes, but Rachel doubled down. "It was an oversight." Prescott exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Miss Quinn, I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." 9:55 a.m., the final nail in the coffin. Angela could have stopped here. Rachel was already in deep water, and Judge Prescott wasn't going to let this slide. But Angela wasn't interested in just exposing one bad court officer. She wanted the entire system held accountable. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and pressed play. The recording filled the hallway. Rachel Quinn's voice clear as day, telling Angela to wait, dismissing her while letting other attorneys walk straight in without question. Rachel's face drained of color. The courtroom stilled. Angela let the silence hang. Then she pulled up the second recording, the one from her assistant Lauren. And suddenly, the entire courthouse heard Thomas Calloway's voice. "If we stall her case past today, the board will finalize the acquisition. By the time she gets inside, it won't even matter." Angela looked up. Judge Prescott was watching Calloway now, and for the first time all morning, Calloway looked uneasy. 9:57 a.m. when the judge makes a decision, Judge Prescott let out a slow breath. Then his voice was like a steel blade slicing through the air. "Miss Quinn, you are hereby suspended, effective immediately." Rachel visibly stiffened, but the judge wasn't finished. "An internal audit of your case assignments will begin today. If it is found that your conduct has led to deliberate misconduct, you will face a formal inquiry." Angela saw Rachel's fingernails dig into her own arms. Angela wasn't sure if it was anger or fear, but it didn't matter, because she had won. 1000 a.m., the collapse of Calloway's confidence. Angela finally turned toward Thomas Calloway, who had been standing rigid, watching everything unfold. Judge Prescott followed her gaze and locked eyes with Calloway. "Mr. Calloway, do you deny instructing court personnel to delay Miss Hayes' case?" Calloway gave a tight smile. "Your Honor, I think we're blowing this out of proportion." "Yes or no?" Prescott cut in. Calloway's jaw tightened. For a moment he looked like he was calculating. Then, finally, he exhaled. "I won't deny that a delay was in my client's best interest." A murmur spread through the room. Calloway had just admitted it. Judge Prescott's face hardened. He turned to the court clerk. "Prepare a report of this admission. This will be referred to the State Bar for ethical review." Angela saw it, the shift in Calloway's posture. For the first time since this morning, he wasn't in control. Angela met his gaze. "You should have just let me in." And for the first time all morning, he had no response. 1010 a.m. walking into the courtroom, unstoppable Angela turned, finally stepping toward the double doors leading to her hearing. This was what she had come here for, to fight for her case, to hold Calloway Enterprises accountable for what they had done. But now, this was bigger than just her. As she walked, she heard a quiet voice behind her. "Miss Hayes." She turned slightly. It was the woman in the red blazer. Her expression was steady, grateful. "Thank you." Angela nodded once. "Don't thank me yet. This fight isn't over." Then she stepped inside the courtroom, and for the first time in her career, she knew she wasn't just walking in for herself. She was walking in for everyone who had ever been told to wait. And this time, no one could stop her. Angela Hayes had fought battles before. She had negotiated million-dollar deals, outmaneuvered corporate rivals, and stood her ground in rooms full of men who underestimated her. But this was something else. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting to expose the quiet corruption that had been happening in this courthouse for years. And now she had proof. 10:15 a.m. Entering the courtroom, Angela stepped through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, the weight of everything that had happened still pressing against her chest. The room was structured, orderly, powerful. Rows of polished wooden benches lined the space, attorneys whispering in hushed tones while clerks moved between desks. At the front, Judge Prescott settled into his chair, adjusting his microphone. Angela took her seat at the plaintiff's table, setting her briefcase down with deliberate precision. She felt every pair of eyes on her. The attorneys for Callaway Enterprises were already in place, dressed in matching gray suits, looking as if they had been plucked from a corporate magazine. At the center of them all, Thomas Callaway sat back in his chair, arms crossed. And despite everything that had just happened outside, despite the public humiliation he had just endured, he was still smirking. Angela narrowed her eyes. Callaway thought he could still win this. He thought this was just a minor inconvenience. He thought that the power of his firm, his connections, his money, would still tip the scales in his favor. Angela had news for him. 10:20 a.m. Judge Prescott takes control. Judge Prescott cleared his throat, commanding the room's attention. "We are here today to address the lawsuit filed by Miss Angela Hayes against Callaway Enterprises. However, before we proceed," Angela saw it immediately. The way Callaway's fingers twitched against the desk, the way his jaw tightened just slightly. Because Callaway had thought the investigation into his misconduct would be handled separately, quietly. But Judge Prescott wasn't letting that happen. "Before we proceed," the judge repeated, "we need to discuss the actions of Mr. Callaway outside of this courtroom." A ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. The attorneys for Callaway Enterprises shifted uncomfortably. Callaway leaned forward slightly, lips parting in protest. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I don't see how that's relevant to—" "Sit down, Mr. Callaway." Callaway's mouth snapped shut. Angela allowed herself the smallest smirk. For the first time since this began, Callaway wasn't in control. 10:25 a.m. Presenting the evidence, Judge Prescott turned toward Angela. "Miss Hayes, I understand you have evidence relevant to this matter." Angela nodded. She reached into her briefcase, pulled out her phone, and placed it on the table. With a calm, deliberate movement, she pressed play. The audio filled the courtroom, Rachel Quinn's voice dismissing Angela. The sound of Callaway Enterprises attorneys walking in without delay. The second recording, her assistant, Lauren, whispering about the conversation she overheard. And then Callaway's own voice. "If we stall her case past today, the board will finalize the acquisition. By the time she gets inside, it won't even matter." The courtroom was silent, not just quiet, silent. Angela didn't look at Callaway. She didn't need to, because she knew without a doubt she had just destroyed him. 10:30 a.m. The fallout begins. Judge Prescott leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Angela watched as his fingers drummed against the wooden bench. Finally, he turned toward Callaway's legal team. "Do any of you have an explanation for this?" One of the attorneys, a man in his mid-40s with a nervous sweat forming at his temples, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, Would like to request a private discussion before. Denied. The attorney flinched. Judge Prescott's gaze was sharp. Unforgiving. This is not a negotiation. He turned toward the court clerk. I want this recording entered into the official court record immediately. Angela saw Calloway's shoulders tighten, because this wasn't just bad press anymore. This was a legal disaster. This was evidence of deliberate misconduct. 1035 a.m. The judge's decision. Judge Prescott sighed. Angela could see the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Finally, he spoke. Mr. Calloway, this court finds your actions to be in direct violation of legal ethics. As such, I will be filing a formal complaint with the state bar. Angela saw Calloway inhale sharply. The state bar. This wasn't just a fine or a slap on the wrist. This was his career. His legal reputation. If the bar ruled against him, he could lose his license to practice law. Angela watched as his fingers curled into fists, but he said nothing, because he couldn't. Judge Prescott turned toward Angela. Miss Hayes, we will now proceed with your case. However, let me assure you, your experience today will not be forgotten. Angela inclined her head. For the first time all morning, she felt like she could finally breathe. 1040 a.m. The end of the beginning. As the hearing officially began, Angela focused on her case. She wasn't just here to expose Calloway's corruption. She was here to win. But as she sat there, listening to opening statements, she knew one thing: this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been forced to wait, every person who had ever been dismissed, delayed, and silenced. And no matter how this hearing ended, she wasn't going to stop fighting. Not now. Not ever. Angela Hayes sat in the courtroom, her fingers resting lightly against the cool wood of the plaintiff's table. The weight of everything that had happened that morning still pressed against her chest, but this time, she wasn't the one on trial. For the first time, the power had shifted. She had exposed the quiet corruption that had been working against her. She had forced a reckoning inside a system that had tried to keep her silent. And now, it was time to finish the job. 1045 a.m. The opening statements. Judge Samuel Prescott adjusted his glasses, his face unreadable as he shuffled through the case files before him. Finally, he cleared his throat and turned his gaze toward the courtroom. We will now proceed with the case of Hayes v. Calloway Enterprises. Angela inhaled deeply. This was it. Her lawsuit against Calloway Enterprises, the case that had brought her here in the first place. A lawsuit that should have begun over an hour ago. A lawsuit that Thomas Calloway had tried to make disappear. Angela glanced across the room, locking eyes with Calloway himself. He was sitting rigidly, his usual smug expression replaced with something else, something that looked an awful lot like anger. Good. Angela hoped he was furious. She hoped he was seething. Because no matter how much power Calloway thought he had today, it wasn't going to save him. 1050 a.m., the first strike. Judge Prescott turned toward Calloway's lead attorney, Richard Langford, an older man with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. Mr. Langford, we will begin with your opening statement. Langford rose slowly, buttoning his expensive gray suit. Angela watched as he gathered himself, schooling his expression into calm control. Your Honor, he began, his voice smooth and practiced. This case is nothing more than a simple contractual dispute, which my client has every legal right to contest. Angela felt her jaw tighten. She had heard this strategy before. Calloway's team wanted to downplay what had happened, to make it seem like this was just a standard business disagreement. As if they hadn't deliberately stolen her contract, as if they hadn't tried to manipulate the court into delaying her case. Langford continued, his voice full of carefully calculated confidence. The plaintiff, Miss Hayes, is an intelligent and successful businesswoman, and while we respect her achievements, we must also acknowledge that in the world of business, misunderstandings happen. Angela felt her fingers tighten around her pen. Misunderstandings. They stole my contract. They blocked me from entering the courtroom. They tried to erase me. And they thought they could frame this as a misunderstanding. Angela kept her expression neutral, but inside, her anger burned. Langford finished his statement, then sat down, perfectly composed. Judge Prescott turned toward Angela's attorney, Mark Westfield, a sharp, no-nonsense man in his early 50s. "Mr. Westfield, your opening statement." Angela's attorney rose without hesitation. And just like that, the game had changed. 1055 a.m., the case for the truth. Mark Westfield walked to the center of the courtroom, his stance calm but firm. "Your Honor, this case is not about a misunderstanding." Angela felt a small surge of relief. Westfield wasn't playing their game. He wasn't dancing around the facts. He was hitting them head-on. This is about deliberate deception. It's about a company that knowingly violated a contract, stole intellectual property, and attempted to strong-arm Miss Hayes out of a business deal she rightfully secured. Angela watched as the jury members leaned in slightly. They were listening. Westfield turned toward Calloway's side of the room. "And we will prove," he said, his voice unwavering, "that Mr. Calloway and his associates engaged in unethical tactics, not just in business but in this very courtroom, to suppress evidence and delay justice." Angela saw Calloway shift uncomfortably. Westfield wasn't just fighting for a contract. He was fighting to expose everything. He turned back to the judge. "We are here today to ensure that Miss Hayes receives the justice she deserves. No more delays, no more diversions. It's time for the truth to come out." He sat down, and the room was silent. 1100 a.m., the evidence that shattered everything. Angela watched as the first round of evidence was submitted. Emails, contracts, a paper trail of deception. Each document was a blow to Calloway's case. Each piece of evidence proved what Angela already knew. She had been cheated. She had been lied to. And now the entire courtroom could see it. Calloway's team scrambled to counter. They tried to twist the facts, shift the blame. But every time they did, Westfield shut them down. By the time the first witness was called, Angela could see it in Calloway's expression. He knew. He was losing. 11:45 a.m. Calloway's final desperation. As the proceedings stretched on, Calloway's composure cracked. Angela saw it in the way his fingers drummed anxiously against the desk, in the way his attorneys whispered hurriedly behind him. Then it happened. Calloway stood. "Your Honor, I move for a recess." Angela's stomach twisted. He was trying to buy time. Again, Judge Prescott didn't even hesitate. Motion denied. Angela saw it. The moment Calloway realized there was no way out, no more tricks, no more delays, this was happening. 1200 p.m. The collapse of Calloway Enterprises. The judge turned toward Calloway's team. "Do you have anything else to present?" Langford adjusted his tie, looking tense. Calloway remained silent. They had nothing. Judge Prescott exhaled, then turned toward Angela's side of the room. "The court rules in favor of Miss Hayes." The words hit like a thunderclap. Angela's heart raced. She had won. She had fought for her place, her company, her reputation, and she had won. Calloway closed his eyes. Angela rose slowly, adjusting her blazer, and as she walked toward the exit she heard Judge Prescott's final words. "Mr. Calloway, you are now subject to further legal review regarding ethical violations committed during this case." Calloway's jaw tightened. Angela walked past him, pausing only briefly. She met his gaze. And for the first time, Calloway looked afraid. She smiled. "I told you," she whispered. Then she walked out. And this time no one could stop her. Angela Hayes had won. She had walked into the Atlanta federal courthouse, expecting a battle over a contract dispute, but instead, she had exposed a system of quiet corruption. forced accountability where none existed, and defeated one of the most powerful corporate attorneys in the city. The gavel had come down. She had won. And yet, as she stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the weight in her chest told her this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. 12:30 p.m. Walking out a different woman, the courthouse doors creaked open as Angela stepped out onto the steps. A warm breeze brushed against her face, but she barely noticed it. Her mind was still replaying the last few moments inside, the look on Calloway's face when Judge Prescott ruled against him, the stiffness in his attorney's posture as they realized they had no legal escape, the sheer shock in the courtroom as the people who had spent years watching the system bend for men like Calloway suddenly saw the unthinkable. It didn't bend for him this time. Angela had fought and she had changed something today, but there was still so much left to do. 12:35 p.m. The crowd outside Angela hadn't expected anyone to be waiting for her, but as she reached the bottom of the steps, she saw them. Reporters, microphones, cameras flashing, and behind them, a small group of people, mostly Black and Latino, some dressed in business attire, others in more modest clothing. Some of them had been inside the courthouse that morning, waiting for cases of their own. Others had likely seen the news online. One of them, a middle-aged Black woman in a blue blazer, stepped forward. "Miss Hayes," she asked hesitantly. Angela turned toward her. "Yes." The woman's voice trembled slightly, but her words were clear. "Thank you for standing up to them." Angela's breath caught in her throat, and then from the small crowd a second voice, a third. "What you did today mattered. They've been doing this for years. You gave us hope." Angela felt her fingers tighten around the handle of her briefcase, because it hit her in that moment. This wasn't just about her case anymore. This was about all of them. 12:40 p.m. The reporters close in Angela barely had time to process the moment before a voice called out, "Miss Hayes, a word for Channel 5 News." The reporters moved in. Microphones were suddenly in front of her face. "Do you believe this case will lead to wider investigations? What do you have to say about the judge's decision? Do you think Thomas Calloway's legal career is over?" Angela inhaled sharply. She could see their angle already. They wanted a scandal. They wanted her to say something explosive, to gloat, to give them the perfect headline. But Angela wasn't playing their game. Instead, she lifted her chin, keeping her voice measured, powerful. "This case was never just about me. It was about a system that has gone unchecked for too long. And today we took a step toward fixing it." A murmur rippled through the reporters, but Angela wasn't done. "The fight doesn't stop here." 12:45 p.m. The phone call that changed everything. Angela had barely stepped away from the reporters when her phone buzzed in her blazer pocket. She pulled it out. "Lauren." Her assistant's voice was urgent the moment she answered. "Angela, you need to see this." Angela's brow furrowed. "See what?" "It's already online. The audio recording, the courthouse footage. It's going viral." Angela stopped walking. "Viral?" Lauren's voice buzzed with excitement. "People are talking, Angela, not just about the case, but about the court delays, the discrimination, the corruption." Angela's pulse sped up. She pulled up her social media feed, and there it was. A video uploaded less than an hour ago. The title, "They made her wait, now the whole system is about to fall apart." Over 500,000 views. Angela clicked play. The video showed everything: Rachel Quinn dismissing her at the check-in desk, white attorneys walking in without being stopped, Angela demanding answers. And then, the moment Judge Prescott exposed the corruption for what it was, Angela could barely breathe. This was bigger than she ever imagined. 12:50 p.m. The warning. Angela's phone buzzed again. A new caller ID. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Angela Hayes speaking." A deep male voice came through the line, cold, calculated. "Miss Hayes, you don't know me, but I know you." Angela's spine went rigid. The voice continued. You made a mistake today. You don't understand the forces you're dealing with. Angela's jaw clenched. Is that a threat? A beat of silence. Then it's a warning. Click. The line went dead. Angela stared at her phone, her heart hammering. For the first time that day, she realized that winning this case might not have been the end of the fight. It was the start of something much bigger, and whatever it was, she was ready.